So first, I want to just welcome everyone here today. We are incredibly excited to see the launch of the Radical Pedagogies Conference here today at DMU. And before I actually sort of offer some comments to frame the day, I actually want to invite Dr. Claire Hurley, who's a lecturer in American and 20th century literature at Kent, because actually part of what we're doing today with the Radical Pedagogies DMU event is also sort of a feed on from a conversation that began last year at Kent. And so I'd like to invite her up to give a little bit of commentary about that conversation.
Okay, thanks very much. Just very briefly, hi everyone, I'm Claire. I'm a lecturer at Kent. I'm also a trade unionist and an activist. And just to give a brief kind of history of the idea of radical pedagogies and where that came from, it was actually myself and a colleague of mine, Tom Ritchie, who can't be here today, unfortunately. But we were basically sick and tired of kind of rehearsing and reproducing the same forms of traditional pedagogy that we'd been taught as undergrads and then we'd carried on as PhD students. So we were kind of sick of this and we thought, what are we going to do? We want to try and, really challenge the kind of institutional structures that reproduce ideas of whiteness and structural inequality that we're all familiar with. So the first event was much broader than today's, but it really focused on kind of pedagogy as practice and ways in which educators, lecturers, and very kind of interdisciplinary actors can basically try and challenge the institutional systems in which we work. So I'm so excited to be here today. My work has actually led me in this direction of anti-racist work as well, so it's a fantastic kind of combination of things. I want to say thanks to Mel for taking on the mantle of continuing with Radical Pedagogies, and do speak to one of us or any of the organisers if you are actually interested in carrying on the kind of Radical Pedagogies legacy, because what we would love really is for these events to be continuous. We had the first one at Kent last January, and so we'd love to continue with Radical Pedagogies in different forms in an ongoing way, so do come and speak to us about that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So again, it's our pleasure really to welcome you today to the second installment of what we hope is really an ongoing series for Radical Pedagogies. This conference, like the initial conference, really aims to kind of foster a network of exchange, of a collaboration between educators, students, activists, researchers, academics, all of us who are interested in disruptive, transformative, justice-oriented teaching and learning practice. In our current moment of political uncertainty, misinformation, fake news, overt and covert violence, and systemic disempowerment operating with impunity, the stakes of our conversations and the work here today are both necessary and urgent. But make no mistake, these have been necessary and urgent conversations for some time. In 1971, Bernard Cord, a Grenadian-born educator, activist, and academic, published a short pamphlet titled "How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British Education System." Drawn from his experiences teaching and working with Black children who had been labeled and targeted for placement in what was described at the time as these educationally subnormal schools designed to segregate children based on perceived educational deficiencies, Cord's work aimed to speak directly to Black parents in diagnosing the ways in which the British education system operated in such a way that stifled intellectual growth and limited academic achievement along racial lines. His work drew attention to such issues, including discriminatory policies and practices backed by educational authorities, racism embedded in the curriculum, culturally biased assessments, the underrepresentation of Black teachers in schools, low expectations coupled with benign neglect informing teaching practice, and the emotional and psychological trauma caused by being in a hostile environment for Black students. In presenting both qualitative and quantitative evidence, Cord hoped that his work would address what he saw as a profound knowledge gap about the scope and complexity of the dilemmas facing Black students, which he hoped could then be harnessed to empower communities, to hold institutions and authorities accountable and effectively organize and advocate for social change. And I very much, along the same lines as Cord, think that is part of what our work here to do today is about, sort of diagnosing in such a way that we can begin to effectively advocate in different ways for the types of transformations that we want to see through engaging radical pedagogies. In an interview with The Guardian over 3 decades after his work was originally published, Bernard Cord noted that the same British education system that had failed children of the 1960s and 1970s was the same system that was continuing to fail a new generation in ways reflective of old processes and unreconditioned logics. In his words, when society fails one generation of children, it lays the foundation for a similar, even worse set of failures in the generation to follow. Although Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton had already coined the term institutional racism in their 1967 treatise, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, when Cord originally wrote How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British Education System a few years later, he didn't adopt the same terminology to describe what was happening in British schools in the late 1960s and early 70s. Instead, we see this term's uptake in the UK gain wider traction in the wake of the McPherson report on the Stephen Lawrence inquiry 20 years ago in 1999, with a headline that marked the Metropolitan Police as institutionally racist. Today, we gather in conversation and reflection on the legacy of the McPherson report and its unfulfilled work in regards to naming and confronting institutional racism in the educational arena, an agenda which several of the presentations today, I am sure, will echo, is one that is clearly unfinished. Likewise, today we convene in an effort to consider the oftentimes overlooked elements of the McPherson report, which highlight a need to think about dismantling and disabling racism systematically through coordinated actions within institutions and by a wider society at large. Although McPherson's recommendations for policing are well known, the report was clear that the educational system at all levels has a vital role to play in addressing racism through curricular content, procedures for evidence gathering, policy development, and pedagogic practice. And quite honestly, when I think about where our greatest strengths and reservoirs of often untapped transformative social power reside, even in the midst of limitations and structural deficiencies, I still believe that it is within the bowels of our teaching and learning practice, our frameworks for knowledge production, and our work in developing the next generation of thinkers, problem solvers, and thought leaders. That's where our greatest capacity to make meaningful change in addressing inequities that cut across the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, citizenship status, socioeconomic position, age, and perceived levels of disability lie. Like bell hooks, I believe that as we seek to engage radical pedagogies, we are in fact employing strategies of teaching and learning to transgress that which we find unjust. We are resisting and refusing the uses of education as a tool of conformity to maintain an inequitable status quo. Instead, when we engage radical pedagogies, when we share and develop these pedagogies, I believe that we are in fact tapping into the possibility of freedom making, a work that anticipates a radically different society that acknowledges difference, yet works for the benefit of all. And no matter where we enter this conversation today, as educators, as researchers, as academics, as parents, as people who are students still in the education system, that is a conversation that we all have a stake in. So I welcome you to join the conversation today. And I just want to sort of outline, there are a number of ways that we are hoping that people will be able to engage this conversation about radical pedagogies. Obviously, we have an incredibly exciting program of speakers with incredible content about the work that they're doing. But we also want to encourage you to use our hashtag on social media, RadicalDMU19. What is that? The hashtag RadicalDMU19. We're also tweeting through the SLRC account and invite you to @us at SLRC _DMU. There's also a live stream to invite a wider community into our conversation today, and we hope to very much have sessions that allow folks who are not able to actually physically be in the room be included in our conversation. And then the other thing I'd like to highlight in terms of how we're trying to sort of facilitate a much more inclusive conversation is that even throughout the day, you'll notice in rooms that you'll see light bulbs, you'll see thought bubbles, and you'll also see these boards that are plastered in the rooms where you can use Post-it notes to sort of share your thoughts, share your questions, share your ideas in the moment. We're hoping that, again, this conversation is able to spark all sorts of different ways that we can think about what we do, how we do it, and how we can share best practices that will sort of, again, anticipate that world that we all want to see that looks radically different. Finally, before I introduce my speaker, the speaker for this morning, our keynote, which I'm really excited about, I'd really like to acknowledge the amazing and tremendously just inspiring conference program team. And I actually want to have everybody stand up. So Melanie Crofts, again, has already been acknowledged. Please stand up. Richard Hall, Lucy Ansley, Mohammed Yassin Kassam, Monica Barrett, Sherilyn Pereira, Lisa Palmer, and also our events team. So again, I just want to acknowledge the work that's gone into imagining the possibilities for this day, and we're all just really excited about having you here on campus and welcoming you to DMU. So again, throughout the day, these are also people that are happy to just help facilitate your place at DMU today and being a part of this conversation. So I just want to definitely sort of thank the team there. So again, really excited to welcome our keynote speaker. Silhouette Boucher is a senior lecturer in education studies at the University of East London and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. She is currently developing and teaching modules across the early childhood and education subject area, where she leads the critical pedagogies model for level 6 education studies undergraduate students. Pedagogies on the module include Freirean critical race, black feminists, and hip hop. She is currently a member of the International Center for Public Pedagogy and a PhD candidate at the University of East London, researching hip hop and grime pedagogies and praxis of Black British young women and girls in non-formal education. In a recent article appearing in The Conversation, Silhouette's work has challenged us to think about hip hop as a tool of critical engagement in the classroom. In it, she argues that hip hop is a resource that provides relevant content and methods that allow students to grapple with contemporary issues and develop their political consciousness. So we are really excited to hear more about your work and all the different ways that you are engaging in a kind of radical pedagogic practice in and beyond the classroom. Welcome.
Thank you.